We can't tolerate this anymore. These tragedies must end.
The US president calls for change after a gunman kills 20 children and 6 adults in an elementary school. Will this really be the tipping point in the debate over gun control in the US? You're watching Inside Story, Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. He's had to make speeches like this 3 times before during his presidency, consoling communities where mass killings had taken place, from Tucson, Arizona, to Fort Hood, Texas, to Aurora, Colorado. But it was only after the killing of 20 children, ages 6 and 7, that President Barack Obama said it was time for action.
Can we say that we're truly doing enough to give all the children of this country the chance they deserve to live out their lives in happiness and with purpose? I've been reflecting on this the last few days, and if we're honest with ourselves, the answer is no. We're not doing enough, and we will have to change.
While President Obama did not actually use the word gun in his speech to members of the Newtown, Massachusetts community, gun control has now become the focus of discussion. The US has the highest gun ownership per capita in the world, 9 guns for every 10 Americans. All of the guns used by the Sandy Hook Elementary School gunman were obtained legally by his mother, who was also killed. He was armed with 4 weapons and used a semi-automatic rifle with dozens of high-velocity rounds to kill the children and the adults. Opponents of gun control say guns should not be blamed for the actions of a person. And President Barack Obama acknowledged that there isn't one answer to ending this type of violence, but said more had to be done.
We will be told that the causes of such violence are complex, and that is true. No single law, no set of laws can eliminate evil from the world or prevent every senseless act of violence in our society. But that can't be an excuse for inaction. Surely we can do better than this. If there's even one step we can take to save another child, or another parent, or another town from the grief that's visited Tucson and Aurora and Oak Creek and Newtown, and communities from Columbine to Blacksburg before that, then surely we have an obligation to try.
So, is more stringent gun control the answer to preventing mass shootings in the US? To discuss this, we're joined from Los Angeles by Adam Winkler. He's a specialist in American constitutional law and author of the book Gunfight: The Battle Over the Right to Bear Arms in America. From San Francisco, we're joined by Mark Follman, a senior editor at Mother Jones, who has produced a special report on mass shootings in the US. And here in the studio, we have Christian Heyne, the grassroots coordinator for the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. Christian, first of all, do you really feel that the debate now underway is different from the pretty inconclusive debates we've had in the past?
Yeah, I really do think that. I think that what you need to do when you're looking at the situation and the situation that we are in now as a country is to really evaluate what just happened in this last election cycle too, and realize that the American public has been getting to this point for some time, even if it's just getting to our legislators right now to kind of get the political courage to make things happen properly. If you look at the last election, the NRA spent over $10 million in the election and got a point.
National Rifle Association.
The National Rifle Association.
The main gun lobby.
The main gun lobby of the United States. They spent over $10 million in these campaigns and had a 0.83 return on their investments.
We do have a graphic on that, actually, which I was going to come to later, but we might as well do it now then. Because, I mean, that is part of the argument for why there isn't change, because of the power of the gun lobby. But we have this poll from the Center for American Progress, which suggested that the political influence of the NRA has been overstated. In the 2012 election, the NRA spent $13.4 million trying to influence congressional races, but they lost 7 out of 8 of the key races they targeted. And they were similarly unsuccessful in Senate races, for example, spending $1 million in a failed attempt to help defeat Senator Sherrod Brown in Ohio. Similarly, George Allen lost in Virginia after the NRA spent $700,000 on his campaign. In 3 states targeted by the group, Colorado, North Carolina, and Virginia, only about a quarter of voters recalled hearing or seeing anything about the race from the NRA. And overall, the Sunlight Foundation, a campaign finance watchdog, found that the NRA's return on investment in their 2012 general election, this is a statistic I think that you're citing, Christian, the return was less than 1%, giving it the worst track record of all major political committees and organizations.
That's absolutely right. And if you couple that information, because you hear all the time on the Hill that the NRA is, if you cross the NRA, if you stand against the NRA, they are going to make you pay politically. We saw in this election that's just not the case. There was no group that was less successful in doing so. If you couple that with the polls that Frank Luntz has put together from, he's a Republican pollster, and he did this poll for Mayors Against Illegal Guns. He found that gun owners resoundingly are approving the measures that we as gun violence prevention advocates are advocating for. They overwhelmingly support, universal background checks, but that does not stop the fact that in 33 states in this country or more, you can buy a gun without undergoing a background check.
Okay. Well, Professor Winkler, I mean, taking that long historical view, then, do you see something different again in the past after Aurora and Tucson? We saw a spike in gun sales, in fact, and then the debate just kind of fizzled out. Is this time different?
It feels different to me. I guess seeing 20 children mercilessly slaughtered in a schoolroom is enough to change a lot of people's attitudes about guns. I think the political environment in Washington is also changing. I think that President Barack Obama has been living in fear of talking about gun control. He had to run for re-election, and many swing state voters really feel very negative towards gun control and love their guns. So he was afraid of offending them. But that's changed, and I think in Washington for years it's been the conventional wisdom that you can't take on the NRA. But we've seen from the data that you've already discussed that the NRA had a very tough November where most of its candidates lost. So I think people are going to be rethinking the traditional reluctance to take on the NRA.
And I should add that we did ask the NRA to join our debate, but they declined. Mark Follman, and yet from the White House just today actually, the spokesman Jay Carney reiterated there are no specific policy proposals being put forward yet by the administration, and yet President Obama does talk about meaningful action. I mean, are we seeing real movement, do you think? Can you, as far as the White House is concerned, why no policy proposals yet?
Well, I think in part it's because it's a very complicated problem. Certainly the enormous number of guns in this country, the relatively very easy accessibility of those guns, but then you also have other factors too. One is mental illness. You see this in these mass shooting cases. And I think part of it too is just a groundswell of political will to have real change. And I agree with Professor Winkler that we may really start to see that given the just sheer horror of what happened in Newtown. But it's also the frequency of these events happening. It's, I think Americans are starting to realize that more and more that this is a recurring problem. President Obama noted in his moving remarks last night that this is the 4th time that he's found himself consoling victims' families. But in fact, as our investigation at Mother Jones shows, there have been quite a few more than that since he's been president. Our study of the last 30 years, we found 62 mass shootings in the United States, and they've been increasing in frequency. This year, 2012, is the worst in modern history. We've had 7 this year alone. So I think as more and more Americans realize the frequency and scope of this problem, we'll see more political will for change, and perhaps that will put some wind in the sails of people advocating for that in Washington and on Capitol Hill.
All right, well, Christian, I suppose as we talk about change today, it's quite important to be specific about what is being called for and what isn't being called for. But what sort of measures are you advocating? Yeah,
well, I mean, we hit part of one of the ones that I think has the most potential to do good in this country, which is the background check system. And that's fixing the background check system in 2 systematic directions. The first being universal background checks, which we were touching on earlier. I've gone to a Virginia gun show, and I have personally handed a wad of cash to an individual and received a gun with no paperwork, no questions asked, no bill of sale, and no background check. Another issue with the background checks, though, is that the names of individuals who are prohibited purchasers, who are federally prohibited from purchasing guns in this country, their names just aren't getting into the NICS database. That's because states aren't being required, they're not being enforced, and they're not being punished for not including names into that NICS database. And agencies are also not including names of individuals who are prohibited purchasers. So the way
is that because of a political stance, or is it just because of funding?
Well, there's some myths about certain laws regarding HIPAA and what information they can give and what information they can't give. But they're all, like I said, they're just like they sound. They're myths. When the president last night, and once again those moving words that he gave last night, he said that he was willing to use the full force of his presidency, and if he really wants to do that, Michael Bloomberg brought up on Meet the Press the other day, he could use his executive orders to fix that aspect of the background check on his own if he is serious about making a real difference, especially when dealing with mental health. He could go ahead and help solve this problem.
It's interesting just to, Mark, I know you want to come in, but actually go ahead first of all, actually. I was just about to have a few more details from your survey, actually, from Mother Jones.
Sure. Well, sure. And I just wanted to add one very key piece of data from our investigation, which supports what Christian is saying, just how poorly the system works. In the 62 cases we've studied of these mass shootings, we found that 80% of the perpetrators had obtained their weapons legally.
Right.
And the vast majority of them had obviously mental health problems. Many of them had shown some prior signs of those problems. So it really begs the question, how is it so easy for people like this to get their hands on Glocks with high-capacity magazines and semi-automatic assault rifles?
Right, just to flesh out that Mother Jones investigation then into mass shootings that took place in the US over the last 30 years, they found that in 48 out of 60, or 80% of incidents, the guns were obtained legally. In 11 incidents, they were obtained illegally. As far as the type of guns used, 66 were semi-automatic handguns, 35 were assault weapons, 20 were revolvers, and 17 were shotguns. Professor Winkler there, I mean, that suggests that even with more stringent legislation, and indeed just more stringent enforcement of existing legislation, that what happened in Newtown wouldn't have been prevented then necessarily.
And we have to recognize that no matter what gun control laws we have, there's still the possibility of mass shootings. We've seen it in other countries that have very strict gun control laws. Norway last year had one of the worst mass shootings in human history, and they have very strict gun control laws. Nevertheless, there are things we can and should do to reduce the daily death toll from guns. 80 people die every day from gunshot wounds here in America. Most of those are suicide. A large number of them are criminal acts, criminal homicide. We can do more to lower that number. And let's face it, if we take that 80 number and reduce it to 79 or 78, then every month we'll be saving more people than died in the Shady Hook Elementary School on Friday. So that's where our gun policy should be focused on, reducing the total number of lives lost to gun violence.
But when we're talking about the types of guns potentially being outlawed or and so forth, are there clear definitions of what constitutes acceptable and non-acceptable, unacceptable weaponry? Where does one draw the line exactly, Christian?
I mean, it's a good question. I think that, obviously Dianne Feinstein, you talk about the next legislative session, she's going to be introducing a bill on the first day of Congress. She's already let us know that. And she's going to be looking at a comparison between the '94 ban that was already there and the California's very aggressive assault weapons bans. I think that, they define it in various ways, and it has to do with the technology and what's going on. But I think that what's important is the dialogue that we have, where people are so afraid of the word ban, and they think that that's going to lead to confiscation of all Second Amendment rights and everything that's going on. But it's important to know that, look at the shootings, and Mother Jones does a great job of exposing exactly the type of firepower that's going on here and the mental illness that follows. But if you look at Aurora, an AR-15 with a 100-drum magazine, this has no purpose for hunting. This has no purpose for self-defense. This gun and that novelty of a 100-drum magazine has one purpose, and it was to do exactly what he did, to shoot large amounts of very deadly, accurate firepower.
Right.
And weapons.
Yeah, and I think the easy availability of those types of weapons in particular is an undeniable factor that has to be considered here. I mean, look at the weapon that that Adam Lanza used in Newtown and the enormous damage he was able to do.
Yeah.
You know, that you can't, I don't think we can discount the types of weapons entirely when we talk about
Right.
what would constitute reasonable regulations.
But you'll have heard the arguments already, though, that most of these weapons are already out there, even if there is now, you know, even if regulations are reintroduced against semi-automatic combat weapons and so forth. There's so many out there already that it's not going to make much of a difference, is the argument we often hear. Mark?
Well, you know, a lot of people get in their cars and drive drunk too. That doesn't mean that we won't stop them from doing that. I think part of the issue here is being more serious about enforcement. If we're going to decide as a society that we don't want those weapons so easily available, then, you know, we have to put those regulations in place and then enforce them.
Right.
And I think Obama was signaling last night that he's more ready to do that, and perhaps he can do that to some extent with executive branch powers. But ultimately, this is going to take a real groundswell in Congress too, and figuring out how to cope with the issue of gun violence, not just in terms of mass shootings, but more broadly, as Professor Winkler said, and what that means in terms of meaningful changes in the laws.
Right, but then, Professor Winkler, I mean, doesn't that also then encompass all sorts of social and economic policies then, if we're widening that, the argument as to, you know, gun violence in the inner cities, for example, or indeed in rural areas for that matter?
Well, that's right. I mean, we know that so much of the gun crime that we have in America is caused by recidivist criminals, people who have criminal records, people who are involved in gang activity. There's no doubt a lot of our gun violence is tied to the war on drugs and illegal drug dealing among gangs in inner city areas. Nonetheless, there are things that we can and should do to make it harder for criminals to get their hands on guns. Things like increasing the background check system is not prohibitively expensive. It's not prohibitively expensive to give states enough money so that they can provide the mental health adjudication data that the federal background check relies upon. So there are things we can do that won't be terribly expensive and won't break the bank. Broader issues like dealing with our mental health crisis in America, obviously that's going to take a lot more money, a lot more research, a lot more thought, but there are things that we can and should do right here and right now to start reducing the daily death toll from guns.
Why is it such a difficult political issue? I mean, we've talked about the NRA and its role, but, you know, gun owners are a minority and they have been, you know, declining. Gun ownership has been declining over the last few decades. Professor Winkler, and I think your studies, Professor Winkler, have suggested that guns were regulated, you know, since the 19th century, and perhaps it's more of a recent phenomenon. There's this sense that the unfettered access to guns is a fundamental American right.
That's right. I do believe that Americans have always had the right to have guns for personal protection. I think that is established in our Constitution and in the state constitutions of so many of our 50 states. However, we've also always had gun control laws. The Founding Fathers had gun control laws, restricted access to guns by people who they thought were not safe or were a danger to the public welfare. Even the Wild West, the heart of America's gun culture, had restrictive gun laws. It's only over the last 30 years that we've seen the extremism of the NRA, which used to be a gun control advocacy organization, surprisingly enough, but we've seen it now turn to extremism to say that every single gun control law is unconstitutional because it leads us down a slippery slope towards total civilian disarmament. We need to get over that fantasy and start adopting reasonable regulations and seize the debate back from the extremists.
Yeah.
Right, but I mean...
and I think that
yeah, go ahead, Mark.
I was going to say the upshot of that tremendously successful campaign by the NRA has been that you know, not only to stifle political debate, but they've made it very politically costly for our leaders to even take on meaningful discussion of gun control. And I think that there's been even a resurgence of this with the rise of the Tea Party, this, you know, pandering to fear that, you know, the government's coming to take your guns away, that Obama's going to take your guns away. All of that talk has had an enormous chilling effect on meaningful discussion of reasonable gun controls.
Right. Do you think that might actually make President Obama pause before any executive orders? Because that's the sort of thing that's likely to inflame the situation in the South and elsewhere, isn't it?
I don't think so, but I think the real question is what kind of shift will we see in Congress, and particularly with, you know, the folks on Capitol Hill who are going to be up for re-election sooner than later. Their calculation of the way the winds might be shifting now versus that kind of pressure from the tremendous lobbying power and money that the NRA has to target them with. So I think that there has to be a real pushback now on some of these arguments that they've been peddling for quite a while. You see a lot of people argue, for example, that, well, the solution to mass shootings like what we saw in Newtown is to arm more civilians and then they could stop it. And as I detailed in our investigation at Mother Jones, that's just a specious argument. There's no evidence that arming more people would stop that type of
But what
event.
about even as the gun laws have been relaxed steadily over the last few years, the violent crime rates have declined as well? I mean, isn't that perhaps an argument that could be used?
Well, yes, it's an argument that they use, but I don't know that it holds much water. It's perhaps a correlation that has meaning, but there are a lot of reasons that violent crime can be going down. But I do think that it points back to the complexity of this issue. This is not just a matter of gun control laws or tighter gun regulations. There are a number of societal questions that we have to look at, take a hard look at, anywhere from poverty to mental health issues, etc. So
right, which are getting worse,
I
frankly.
think
that polarization is getting worse and worse there. But Professor Winkler, we're running out of time, but what impact did the Supreme Court's decision in 2008 to affirm the individual's right to possess a firearm without needing to be a part of a well-regulated militia, the old Second Amendment discussion that had been raging for so long? What effect did that have on this debate, do you think?
Well, I write about this extensively in my book, Gunfight. The Supreme Court did say that individuals have a right to bear arms, but also went out of its way to make clear that nothing in the Second Amendment calls into question reasonable and effective gun safety laws, banning felons from getting guns, banning the mentally ill from getting guns, banning guns in schools and government buildings. The court was crystal clear on that. I don't think the major impediment to gun control are the courts. I think the major impediment so far is the legislative branch, getting things through Congress.
I mean, there is an argument, though, I suppose, Christian, that having had the Supreme Court affirm that fundamental right to individual gun ownership, perhaps it might make regulation easier because that's a safeguard. Does that perhaps help at all?
I mean, I definitely agree with what Professor Winkler said. I mean, Antonin Scalia, it was a 5-4 decision, and keep in mind this is the same conservative Supreme Court that handed down Citizens United and a number of other very politicized opinions that I do feel that maybe later on they may get re-examined. But that being said, Antonin Scalia went out of his way to say, as Professor Winkler said, that this doesn't mean that this is a free, open right for people to be carrying guns everywhere all the time without any type of screening. You bring up when people bring up the point, a gun somewhere, a single gunman could have saved the people in Aurora. Imagine what that situation would have looked like. You're in a dark room.
This is in cinema, right?
Yeah, in Aurora, Colorado. There's hundreds of people in a dark room with loud noises going on. Somebody breaks into the front of the room, throws 2 cans of tear gas, and starts opening fire on a crowd. Imagine if 10 other people stand up with a gun in that room and start firing. They don't know who to fire at. They're undoubtedly going to hit innocent civilians. And then what happens when police arrive to the situation? Who do they know who's the actual culprit and who they're supposed to be taking down? And we've seen in the string of mass shootings that has happened throughout the summer in Tucson, and now even in this Oregon mall, where individuals almost took action on the wrong people. In this Oregon, an off-duty police officer said he had a gun on him in the mall, but didn't fire because he was worried he was going to hit civilians. And this is somebody who is
right.
trained. He's trained in stress level renewals of how to fire a weapon, whereas we have no training for people who are carrying concealed weapons in our country.
Right. Well, Mark Follman.
Right, and I would just add.
Yeah.
I would just add that you will be very hard pressed to find anyone in law enforcement who advocates for having more civilians armed and standing up and shooting in a dark movie theater when something like this happens, or in a shopping mall. I've spoken with people in the FBI about this, etc. I mean, they're not interested in that, and I think that pretty much says all you need to know.
Well, there does seem to be some resignation there amongst many people that this is going to happen again, and that in the end it is very difficult to prohibit. I mean, I suppose, do you think that's weighing heavily on President Obama, though? I mean, clearly if this does happen again under his watch, though, I mean, it's going to be politically, I mean, even beyond the tragedy, I mean, politically this will be disastrous for him.
I think regardless of any way that you look at this conversation, we have to be happy that a conversation is taking place. So many times when these shootings take place, for some reason there's this push to take guns off of the table. We can't talk about the mechanism in which these mass shootings take place. That's not happening this time, and maybe that's because of the horrific nature of the victims of this crime. but at least people are willing to say, okay, let's have this conversation, let's see what we can do, and if we can somehow lower that 80 people a day, or the 34 murders that occur every day in this country, if we can somehow lower that number, then those efforts were worth it.
Christian Heyne, thank you very much. Mark Follman, thank you. Professor Adam Winkler, thank you as well. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.